Ready? Start. Okay, we can start. Great. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our session of Capturing the Uncanny in Photography, in Contemporary Photography. And I hope you all had a chance to go through the exhibition, to see the works in the exhibition. It's my pleasure here to welcome the panelists. And from my left, I have Elger Esser. His work is downstairs. And Caterina Albano, who is a scholar. And we are delighted to have Caterina to talk especially after some of her wonderful writing about the fear and art in contemporary world. And then Sonja Braas, an artist who lives and works in New York, and her work is equally downstairs, and you have probably noticed and remember some of the wonderful works. And we have got, and I have to say Doctor, I forgot, Dr. Caterina. And before actually the session, I asked everybody whether they had a doctor title, so I would not forget that. And Dr. Rupert Griffiths, who is specialist actually and has organized a week-long workshop about the subject of the uncanny and other scholars. And then David Claerbout.
Dr. David.
No, he's a president, actually, so anyhow, that's great. I'm delighted to have you all here. The topic is of discussion today is capturing the uncanny, but before really capturing the uncanny, maybe we need to a little bit know about what the uncanny is. Is the uncanny in the eyes of the viewer, or is the uncanny in the subject presented? And how is the uncanny? We know from a lot of research and writing that the interest in uncanny came sometimes in the mid-19th century when Friedrich von Schilling wrote about the uncanny and explained that uncanny is something that should have remained a secret, but has come for some reason to evidence, has become known, has become present. And then it went on until a psychologist, Jentsch, at the beginning of 20th century, talked about it and said uncanny, very briefly he talked about it, and said uncanny is some kind of intellectual uncertainty. And that's it. Until 1919, that Sigmund Freud then took on the subject of the uncanny and wrote this incredible essay that I'm sure most of you have read. And again, this uncanny remains very ambiguous. There is not a definition what really the uncanny is. And I'm not even sure after tonight we are going to find out what really uncanny is, but it's always wonderful to talk about it, isn't it? And it is that quality of uncanny, in fact, I think is the most important quality in an image that attracts us in an image. It's not actually the color, it's not the beauty of the person represented in the work or any special scenery, but it's that kind of quality uncanny, that ambiguity that really makes us go back to the image. We have looked into the uncanny in photography for this exhibition, and we have gone from the description of uncanny from magical to something very unsettling, something strange, and finally something which is frightening in some of the works. For example, the first gallery is very serene as you come in, extremely serene. The scenery is there and the works there that are have been worked. There is something special. There's kind of magic. There's something beauty. There's harmonious. In a way, the uncanny is in that. How they have been done, whether they have been done digitally or it's analog and it's a real shot, or like Sternthal says, whenever you put a frame on something, it is altered. And then as you go to the second gallery, you see, in fact, the sense of danger. The works actually are quite frightening, some of them. I mean, churning waters, and actually I realized that the two women in the exhibition are the ones that actually have most frightening scenes. Fire is heading for you, and so anyhow, all that. So basically, we try to bring in the given space that we have different sense of the uncanny, different definition of the uncanny. And here we are so fortunate to have such a panel who can each explain their work, and it is really to us to extract that uncanny in the work. And I would like to start here with Elger Esser.
So I usually don't speak directly on my work. I give somehow an image, and I have this lecture that I held sometimes two times, one in Tampa and one time in Germany in English. So the text originally was written in German and then translated. So I will read it because my English, I mean, you hear a very German accent, so I'm trying my best, yeah. And it reveals somehow the genesis a little bit of my work, yeah. And as I see very young people and maybe just coming out from university or still in the university, I think I'm talking a little bit about my training at the Art Academy in Düsseldorf. The first sentence from my training as a young art student was already one of the most significant. Bernd Becher and I stood freezing in the middle of a field by Dortmund so that we could get a good view of the local blast furnace, and Bernd Becher said to me, "Esser, it's important to have a story to tell." In his modesty, he said a story, but he meant history. You should have history to tell. I see the artist in the best Homeric tradition as a teller of history, who takes the story, summarizes it, and adds to it, trying to give a new form, either in the subject matter itself or in its readability. In my work, for example, The Time Shift, that's why I often try to approach the subject of memory as a visual manifestation of Eigenzeit. Eigenzeit is the proper time. Yeah? Using literary figures like Walter Benjamin, Marcel Proust, or Fernando Pessoa, and to give somehow a bridge to my work. A written text often evokes images, just as these images evoke stories or memories. In the end, it isn't about the kind of proof that it's necessary and expected in the scientific sense, but rather about this evoking, because to summarize it briefly in the words of Marcel Duchamp, there's no solution because there's no problem. With that said, art was and is the last and only oasis of purposelessness, and yet continues to be necessary in every era since the Homo erectus. I believe that almost every serious artistic work, and please excuse the improper restriction, feeds on childhood experiences. The psychologist would call it imprinting, which is a nice, tangible, three-dimensional term. Art doesn't arise from comfort, it arises from discomfort. Something creeps up inside the artists, and this something finds its way out. It's, so to speak, the objectification of a subjective condition, let's call it feeling. The object is once again subjectivized by the observer. This certainly doesn't always succeed, which you can see again and again in the misunderstanding of art. The human psyche cannot exist without repression. That is why the concept of memory is often thought in a positive light. We like to remember nice moments, or with the words of Jean-Paul, memory is the only paradise we can't be expelled from. Bad memories are banished into the underworld of unpleasant experiences, the uncanny, yeah? We cannot simply get rid of these internal images, but we can sublimate them into something else. Physicists use the term of sublimation to describe the direct physical shift of a substance from solid to gaseous state. Psychologists think of it as a defense mechanism. For art, I consider a combination of the two. I would like to read a short text that I composed almost 9 years ago for my students after a 2-week excursion led us to the lagoon city of Venice, and I think it reveals a bit of the genesis of my work. It's always the first time. It's called the short text. I grew up in Italy, just by the way, so then Italy is something that belongs to my first childhood imprints. Venice was supposed to be the high point of the summer holidays at the Lake Garda for the German relatives. I must have been about 10 years young. However, I'd taken a heavy fall the day before while building a treehouse right above the villa in the olive groves of Limone. A stone floor slab had become loose when I tried to climb down quickly to look for some rope. My father later said it was my own fault for rushing. And I fell directly on the slope to the terrace and hit head first. Everything went black, and only the cooling hands and warm words of my grandmother took me out of the state and back into life. The doctor had to come and diagnose a concussion. I felt sick, my head was spinning, the villa became a sick bay. Our excursion to the romanticized and yearned for Venice crashed like that. Out of concern for her beloved grandson, my grandmother also missed out to the lagoon city. She, by the way, never returned to Italy, so she never in her life made it to Venice. Only my uncle and his family would not forego the trip, leaving my father, his girlfriend, and my grandmother to stay behind with me. A second call to the doctor confirmed the impossibility of my transport, leading to tough negotiation with the owner of the villa to prolong our stay. These negotiations were held at the foot of my bed, since I was both the only one who spoke Italian and the reason we had to stay. The landlord was mollified by the white turban decorating my head and finally gave in to the squatters, allowing us to extend my recovery a week longer. I remember eating loads of watermelon and learning to play battleships, nine-man's Morris and chess, and having lovely story read aloud to me. I may have kept my grandmother from seeing St. Mark's Square, but I also managed to extend our holidays even in an unconventional way, the start of a faithful ambivalence. I finally did make it to Venice. It seems nostalgic of me to reveal in these childhood memories and lose myself in anecdotes, but the feeling that started growing inside of me then is one that still surfaces when I think about Venice. I never reached Venice. I have spent a long time puzzling over why this is. I have been to Venice many times, sometimes just for a few days, sometimes for a week, and even some months. I have tried to shorten the search with knowledge, riding to all the lagoon islands, making friends, visiting the same places for a while, then discovering new ones, wandering every last corner of the city. I got orientated and thoroughly lost. But the more experience I gathered, the more unsure was my feeling of finding what I sought. This city always seems to elude me as strongly as I had felt that she was within my reach before my fall. The farther away she appears to me now when every time I approach her from the Liberty Bridge. Loves had been lost and other found in Venice. I came to work or to stroll, to read or just to see. I read Goethe and Ruskin. I saw Bellini's Madonnas, the Carpaccio and the Salute, the Accademia and the Frari Church, Vivarini and Mantegna, Santa Maria dei Miracoli and the capitals of the Doge Palace. And still, to this day, I'm driven again and again and with the same passion. And I do think I've uncovered one small secret in all this time. It's always the first time. As if Venice didn't transform or keep a step ahead in its transformation, I stand always in awe of the eternal questions of existence. Every knowledge opens a new question in the city. Venice has escaped time and appears to us, in its paradoxical and anachronistic character, to be a mirror of our own lives. We return again and again. At best we have changed, yet we can never, with all our experience and awareness, approach this mirror of ourselves. It drives us on, won't let us go, allures us with its beauty, and casts us out with indifference. This city lets us reveal in delusion of grandeur and points out our limitations. Venice is pure reflection in the water and in the sky. Even while it slowly sinks and faces inevitable falling into decay, it's our image, and it's always a step ahead. Aristotle defined the ideal city as one where young and old can hear men's cry and attend men's stride. An untouchable chimera which some, in choosing the suicide, try to touch at last. Venice, and I believe this makes the city unique in this world, is the world. Venice is everywhere and even most within ourselves. She is our portrait turned to stone. Stronger than Rome and the Levante, than Constantinople, and of course than the New World. She is the city of symbols, of utopias, of dreams and hopes, of power and of loss. She is center and periphery, city and landscape. She is sky and earth, fire and water, my Atlantis, mysterious and never found forevermore. At the beginning of my studies was the sentence of Bernd Becher. At the conclusion of my studies during my first exhibition in New York, I met Konrad Klapek, it's a painter, in the hallway of the Academy, and he said to me, "Esser, now you are bound for the rest of your life to the promise given to your work." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elger. Well, in the wonderful text you wrote and you now read for us, there were words like memory, childhood experience, unconscious, and all that really directs towards the uncanny.
Yeah. So I would always say, we talk together with Sonja and David. Somehow we know the uncanny maybe from our lives, but we don't know it from our work. Yeah. But somehow it's related, and it's a projection, or I mean, it's like I talked with the system of Freud. Maybe it's a sublimation, no? The word,
Absolutely.
yeah. And we could have been maybe murderers too, yeah. But we decided to become artists. Yeah.
Well, we are going back to all these afterwards, and meanwhile, I would like to ask you maybe to.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Ziba, for inviting me to speak tonight and to somehow be part to this fascinating exhibition. And I think the title itself, Uncanny Surfaces, is really very interesting and thought-provoking. As I was thinking of my contribution to this evening, I went back to look at Freud's essay, which is a strange text, and in many ways a very ambiguous text, where a lot of what we have already been talking about in terms of ambiguities, dualities, unclear and uncertain relationship between subject and object is embedded in the text itself. And what I would like to draw attention and really sort of open in terms of questions is the tension that Freud brings to the relationship between the concept of the uncanny and the experience of the uncanny. So this individual feeling and what supposedly is an aesthetic concept. Freud starts by wanting to define a feeling, and ended up with giving us a concept and dismissing the experience of the uncanny as a regression to a magical and a primitive state. This movement, so the attempt to dismiss the experience, is very much in line with the historical coming to be of the concept of the uncanny, which historians allocated in the 18th century as sort of forceful coming back of the irrational at the moment where the boundaries of the rational and our rational framework in terms of cultural rational framework were set. And that had continued with the debate around the Enlightenment and Romanticism, from which Freud's essay seems very much to come out. Freud takes us through a tour de force of etymology in this essay, in trying to pin down the origin of the idea of the uncanny. And he takes us to this very fine distinction between the Heimlich and the Unheimlich, and of something that we know and that's really familiar to us, but that comes back to upset us and to subvert and our intellectual framework. And he himself struggles with this relationship between the experience of the uncanny that Freud say he hasn't actually felt for a long time, but that he is attempting to remember for the sake of the essay that he's writing. And he narrates an anecdote when he was in Italy and has wandering around the city. He actually loses his own track and found himself wandering around on the same spot and feeling quite dislocated and unsettled by this experience. So dislocation, uncertainty, ambiguity seems to be the terms that constantly comes back with the uncanny. And in taking on the defense of the uncanny that psychoanalyst Michael Parsons has put forward, I would like to bring us back to the experience of the uncanny, and to the fact that we are trying to intellectualize it too much, that we are trying to tame the uncanny, because it's so subversive, because it is unsettling, because if we are trying to turn it into a concept, we set it back within a rational framework. And this seems to me really important, because the uncanny is not only a theme, but it seems to be a condition of the way in which contemporary art make and invite us to reflect on our experience. Some of these images take us into a duration that merges time with timelessness, space with spacelessness. It is about an event that yet we are not quite sure how to locate. It takes us into a dimension where the real and the virtual not only collapse, but they are playfully manipulated, and their interaction create new boundaries. It opens up different confines, different coordinates. So perhaps we can actually question what is the category of the uncanny, what is this notion of the uncanny, by looking at where we sit in relation to it, where this relationship between the object and the subject resides, and whether there is really a distinction between the object and the subject. Where do the surfaces begin and where do the surfaces end? What are the horizons that define our conditions in a world that continually veer between the real and the virtual? This evening is a live stream. We are in a space that also exists elsewhere at the same time. So I think that we can see the uncanny not only as a negative experience, not only as a fearful experience, and actually perhaps the uncanny today has much less to do with fear than it used to. But we can actually question the very experience of the uncanny as we look at the work in uncanny surfaces and questions and interrogate this experience. Because if our intellectual framework are challenged, if new horizons are open, what are these new frameworks that the uncanny potentially offer us? What is its subversion? What are these new horizons? And what are the implications of all of this, also ideologically and politically? What does this aesthetic experience of the uncanny does by also being an individual, a psychological, a personal experience, a social experience, and destabilization of simple boundaries? And to conclude, I would like to quote Michael Parsons, who observed that the nature of the uncanny is always to waylay us, destabilizing habitual modes of seeing both the world and ourselves, and offering up new ones. It carries the potential to open fresh perspectives. There are to experience which stays or is kept too safely within existing frameworks of understanding. Thank you.
I'm interested in creating work that is ambiguous, that creates uncertainty and, right?
I think so, yeah.
And doubt, and photography allows me to do that because it questions the bareness of things, precisely because it so strongly asserts it. Photography is very ubiquitous and familiar medium, not only because of the omnipresence of images, but also because it's so widely used. Because of the familiarity of photographs, and despite the knowledge of the possibilities of digital or other manipulations, there's a suspension of disbelief. The feeling that what is depicted had to be there, had to have existed in that moment. Or as Roland Barthes put it, the photograph is literally an emanation of the referent. There's an acceptance of photography's two-dimensionality as actual reality. The photographic image is like a shadow or a mirror, but without the necessity of the objects or subjects present. The author of a photographic image, and in fact the image itself, apart from its content, appears to be less visible. The camera is a machine suggesting objectivity. The focus is on content rather than the medium. In other media, the artist's voice in the interpretation of an object or a situation is more apparent, and it adds a layer of abstraction that viewers are aware of. The feeling of authenticity inhibits doubt, thus leaving the viewer open to manipulation. It shapes the immediate direction to the photographs in a powerful way and will linger even after the intellectual response. I aim to achieve this back and forth between the initial emotional response and the following intellectual reaction, confronting the viewer with his or her own perception and preconceived notions, creating a feeling of unease and perhaps a moment of intellectual uncertainty. At the same time, the image as image reappears apart from its content. The series that is up there is a series that consists of images that I photographed in real nature as well as in museums, botanical gardens, and zoos. They have different levels of reality in them. Like this, for example, has real plants in front of a painted background. Some of them have birds that are, like this one is totally fake in a museum. Everything is either painted or is stuffed birds. And I combine them with real ones. These are all analog, so there's no combination within the pictures, it's single pictures. And what happens is that after a while, because there are images that are very clearly fake, let me look at it this way. When people look at these images and they go, there's this suspension of disbelief, so they do want to believe the image even though it's like this one that is also downstairs in the exhibition is clearly fake. But then eventually they find out, and it's important to me that they do find it out because I want this to happen. And then they do go back to the ones that are more clearly, this one is also in the museum, but this one is a real one. And the distrust sets in, and people actually go up to the picture and they point to the threads that the birds are hanging off from, but there are none because it's real. So I like to really have this happen where you start to distrust your own perception. The series started because I spent some time in a year in an area of rainforests and jungles and was totally over-prepared for it. Looked at every single image and film and everything that I could get my hand on. When I was there, because of that, really, I was kind of disappointed. The forest was not as dense, there weren't as many animals as I thought. It was nature and not the condensed nature of images. So I caught myself at a moment when there was actually a couple of really large ferrets flying by that my first thought was, who let them out of the cage? And then catching myself in this, because it was such a clash of the experience that I had through the images and the ones of actually being there. And the images clearly were so much stronger that they overshadowed my experience of being there. And it took a while for me to get over that and almost clear my memory of the images. So the images make, and especially photographic images, because we so much believe in them, make such strong memories that create memories and actually overlay our memories, which I think is a very interesting aspect of photography. That we create a past that is a past in images. It's not really a past that we have experienced. And when we look back, because we forget the things that we have done or experienced, we only experience it through the image. It's an edited version. Now, how do I go about this to get this opened? Let me see what we get. It's all on this. Okay. So in the next series, the series Forces, which is series. This one is downstairs as well. I continue working on the subject, and one thing I always go, I deal with things that I notice on myself, and it is always when you're confronted with your perception and you're starting to doubt what it is that you think, where it comes from, and how is it shaped. And I was getting very interested in this romantic notion of landscape, and this fact that people spend a lot of time and money to climb Mount Everest, even though they have to climb over trash and over dead people, and blind eye guy has done it, and one-leg guy has done it, and pretty much everyone has done it at this point, and still there's this attraction, or people go to Antarctica and they have to be on cruise ships that are hiding from each other. The cruise ships are communicating so that the other ship with their people on them don't see them, because otherwise, of course, it wouldn't be the romantic experience, and you wouldn't feel like an explorer of the 19th century. So where does it come from? What is it that we see in it? So I was interested in recreating that, and these are images that the first one was real, and then I built these super romantic, kind of iconic images, reversing it, this idea of the nature that it has to be untouched and free of human experience, and only then is it the real sublime nature. This is reversing it because, I mean, this is not even nature. This is something that is totally touched because it's completely made. These are models that I built in my studio. And then there again, I do want to break the perception, so I will always have images in there that are very clearly fake. Because obviously, if I had actually taken that, I would be dead. And if you go closely, and these are large images, you see that it's these rocks are paper mache, so you can't be fooled with that. So that will lead people to look closely and then rethink the other images as well. And then once they do that, they actually the image comes back with photography. So often you go past the image and right to the content, because what you see is so powerful because you think that it had to be there. So if I use the romance and the beauty of these images to kind of seduce an emotional reaction, and then after the recognition that what you see is not really what you think you see, you change you have to go back and you see it differently. But of course, the lie is not in the image, because the lie is in the set. So what you see is what was there in a way, but it's just not your expected reality. So it's three different levels of reality in that way. And this is a series called The Quiet of Dissolution. It's from the sublime. It seemed to make sense to go from the romantic idea to the next one, to the condensed version of destruction. And I wanted to work on the ambivalence in the understanding and perception of nature in the concentrated form of the natural catastrophe, based on the equating of culture with order and nature with chaos. Despite the more complex definition of and transition between culture and nature, based on the intensifying human influences on nature and the anthropomorphic causes of natural catastrophes, there's a large fascination for that which appears threatening and outside our control. An irrational romantic perception of nature takes place, that of a raging, avenging being that strikes back as an opponent who needs to be restrained. Once the immediate danger has passed, though, it is followed by a comparably irrational repression, an almost complete ignorance of the presence of nature and possible risks. The goal is to return everything to the way it had been before, as if nothing ever happened, and will never happen again, because science, technology, and society will not allow it. This ambivalence can be found in the images, which are pictures of natural disasters, frozen images of the unforeseen, sudden and overwhelming, and they are large-sized pictures of models. This one is downstairs, obviously. And this one will open. And question it through the control and order of the chaos in the image. Mystification is reconstructed and broken down. So these are all models, and I was really interested in these the pictures that were in the media whenever there is a disaster, like with the tsunami. It's a repetitive. They're repetitive. They're very condensed and concentrated. They're there constantly for a short moment, and then they disappear. And I wanted to kind of reconstruct these images just enough in enough of an abstraction that they still cause the emotional reaction, but then allow you to, again, step back and question what it is that you just saw and how you deal with that memory. And this is a series where I was interested in time, which is an important part of photography too, as a chronicler of time, as a moment, and the moment that as soon as it was taken is gone, is dead. So this is a series that pretends to be a walking through a space, and it's a deliberately reduced kind of landscape because I didn't want it to be too narrative. So there are slight changes in the obviously in the light and in the foreground that gives you a feeling that you're walking through time and space, loosely related to the timing that it would be in Antarctica. This is it's 52 images altogether. I reduced this to half of them, and so you're walking through, and at the end you're kind of in a circle, time-wise as well as location-wise, because the last image is very closely related to the first one. It is a bit like a film with the difference that you can go back in the images. So it's not linear time, it's circular time. And it makes you aware of the moment and stops you. So that's the way the work is presented. So, because of time constraints, I did not put in the last work that I'm working on right now. It's a work about fear and living in the US, but here too I find there is a huge feeling of fear and risk everywhere. There's a very strong promoting of risks that don't really exist out of clear reasons. I mean, pharmaceutical companies want you to think that you're dead, that you will die, that you're sick, and you need to take their pills, and it's obviously a very strong way tool to manipulate population through governments. And there's also the interesting part that we're so bombarded with pictures from all over the world that are not really related to us, or that are related to us in really not a serious way. Like in the States, there was total panic with 2 cases of Ebola. Everyone thought that now everyone's going to die. It's totally out of proportion when there are risks that do exist and that don't get any mentioning. And that is partially because there are interests, of course, but it is also the power of images that we are not able to filter enough to be able to distance ourselves. And I think photography as an image has a very powerful role in that, because it's such an emotional medium, because there's no detachment, or there's much less of a detachment. And I believe that is still true, even though we're all aware of manipulation, but there's always been manipulation. Every time you take a picture, of course, even if it's analog, and I work totally analog, it's a manipulation. But still, when people put something on Facebook or on any other social media, I don't think that the first thought is, okay, I'm looking at a picture of the food that my friend just ate. No, you're looking at the food that your friend just ate. You don't think that the person manipulated it. So I don't think we're quite yet evolved into being able to deal with the emotional impact of images, and that this leads to this kind of prevalence of fear and risk that surrounds us. That is very visible right now in the American elections too, and it's used very well by Donald Trump. But so I think that's something that interested me very much, and I'm working on images that portray that in a very subtle way, things that are almost like key pictures that I think that even though they're very much taken back, they will trigger a response to a certain degree, depending, of course, of the experience, memory of the person that are looking at them, but which is also the way that it works. Of course, an image is a very strong trigger, and I'm trying to do this in a very reduced way, and again, to create the opposite effect, that you catch your emotional response to it and become aware of it, which is my work modus. So that's.
Thank you very much, Sonja. In the work, there's a lot of psychology lot of issues to discuss. What is that? Images, photography presents rather than represents, and the fact that we are not ready yet, or we have not been evolved in order to take that emotional confrontation of photography. That's quite an interesting topic, actually, that we can
Yes,
talk about. Two-dimensionality of photography to depict reality. And again, content, medium, knowledge, perception, deception. There are a lot of issues here we can talk about. Maybe we have to order pizza and stay here. Rupert.
Well, yeah, I just want to make a few sort of observations about the uncanny in photography, which actually picks up on quite a few things that have been talked about, and how the uncanny and photography have got a particular resonance with each other, both as a medium and as a practice. So I see the uncanny as operating across a spectrum between the aesthetic and the ontological. At the aesthetic end, which is more sort of Freudian end, there's this kind of spectatorial gaze which kind of looks at the photograph and you have an affective experience of the photograph as uncanny, or producing an uncanny effect, where the world becomes unfamiliar in some way. And then at the ontological end of this sort of spectrum, I see this kind of participatory gaze where one experiences oneself as unfamiliar, which is closer to a sort of Heideggerian understanding of the uncanny, which he puts at the centre of his ontology. So I think these two poles can be aligned to photograph as an artefact on one hand, but also to the practice of photography on the other. And I think there's an overlap between these as well. So the photograph can create an uncanny aesthetic effect, and the practice of photography can make oneself, it could be a sort of uncanny way of being in the world. So the next few slides really relate both to photography as a practice and as an artifact, as an image. So Freud in his essay, which Caterina's talks about, the language, which is really good. Yeah. Got a bit of a So Freud makes a long list of ways in which an uncanny experience can be produced, and underlining them all is an uncertainty or ambiguity about the boundary between self and environment, between subject and landscape, or subject and environment. And romanticism creates a strong distinction between the gazing subject and the gazed upon landscape. And I think the uncanny starts from this spectatorial perspective, but then subverts it, and the landscape gazes back, and we become implicated in the scene before us. So on the right is Hopper's painting of a house which sort of has this sort of presence and this feeling that it's gazing at us, and it's got some sort of intent. So the human subject in the uncanny is placed ambiguously somewhere between or both with or in the environment and the body simultaneously. And then at the same time, clear distinctions between the human subject and the landscape are also present. So there's a sort of oscillation going on between distinction and indistinction, which is a kind of teetering on the edge between two fundamentally different ways of being in the world, I guess. And the soul is an example in this etching by Schiavanetti. Freud uses the idea of the soul after an essay by Otto Rank to illustrate this idea of the soul as like an uncanny double, which kind of is a way of sort of avoiding death in a sense. And on the right there's a photograph by the photographer Stephen Gill from a series called Best Before Date, which is a series of portraits which are all developed using energy drinks. And I think it's an interesting body of work in that it confuses the boundary between the body, the substances that are ingested and the substances that are used to develop the photographs. So it kind of flattens the distinction between the subject, the human subject, and their identity and the material environment that they're within, and brings everything to this kind of flattened level. But also he maintains the spectre of the human subject. So the subject becomes both present and diffused at the same time. And thirdly, I want to talk about the relationship between the uncanny and time and process, which is, I think, particularly resonant with photography. Photography has often been discussed in terms of its mechanistic process of production and reproduction, this kind of modernist linear causal understanding of time, which is divided into discrete instants, and there's a tendency to read the photograph as a single moment in the flow of time, regardless of whether the photographs are actually constructed in this way. And I think the uncanny emerges when this linear and causal understanding of time becomes co-present with a cyclical understanding of time, where you have this acausal understanding of time that's guided by the repetition of habit or like omniscient forces that you can't see necessarily, or compulsion to repeat, religious beliefs and seasons, stuff like that, which I think both Freud and Wilhelm Flusser both talk about as being related to animistic beliefs or magical beliefs, which is where the title of the exhibition comes from. So in terms of photography, I see this as being a dialectic between a topological and topographic way of thinking about the environment and the relationship between subject and landscape, or subject and environment. In this topographic way of thinking, we look at the photograph and see elements in relation to sort of arranged in relation to one another, and through this arrangement we interpret the image. Whereas from a topological perspective, we become participants in the field of vision, and we're implicated in the image. So we no longer see an arrangement of elements, but an interrelationship of processes. So we kind of move from this spectatorial vision into an active, participatory vision. So if we look at the photograph and the processes of its production, and it suddenly becomes apparent that it's a construct, that it's staged or as a model, or, you know, as you were saying earlier, then we move from this position of spectator to participant. We actually enter a social relation with the photographer, in a sense. So the fiction of the photograph becomes visible, and the reality of the photograph equally becomes visible, i.e. the process of its production becomes visible. But the photograph still persists as in its capacity to provide a convincing illusion. So I think to conclude and to try and envelope all of that, I think broadly speaking, we get the uncanny emerges at this sort of uncertainty of whether this moment of uncertainty when we're no longer clear whether we are spectator or participant in the environment, whether it's an image in front of us or the surrounding image. So we kind of, I think both have got to be present. Like, we need to have the ambiguities, like there's a certainty and a certainty of being a participant and a certainty of being a spectator simultaneously. They oscillate. And yeah, I think that's...
Thank you. Thank you very much. Here we have the issue of subject and object and participant, or the subject actually, what the whole issue, how we take actually Uncanny, what it is presented and how we take it actually. It's quite interesting. David, no, I just have to a bit accelerate, and David, it's your turn.
I do have the feeling that there are two things that I would like to talk about. One is slightly more theoretical than this little presentation that I'm going to give first. Because there's a nature of photography that has fundamentally changed around the year 2000, and because you need to put a date on something, it's easy to put a date on 9/11, 2001 as a date where photography fundamentally changes. And you just made me think in what you both said on the Uncanny, about a certain, I always describe it as fear, for something for which previously there was no fear but only certitude, and that was photography. You see, photography has been probably the most important ally in modernity for social change, politics, publicity, marketing, image culture, because it possessed a certain speed of communication, which is beyond the written word and therefore beyond historical writing. Now, around 2001, and actually it starts earlier, when artists like myself and previous generation discovered digital manipulation, as we call it, and producing often large format pictures which deliberately guide you in a different direction. And I'm thinking first and foremost, of course, about Jeff Wall and his theatralizing, do you say it like that? Theatralizing of the human figure, implying consciousness of the person being photographed that is actually being seen and put into scene, up into Andreas Gursky and his whole generation. But that are case-by-case works. Now, around 2001, something changes, and there is, I think, it's a hypothesis, a collective consciousness starting to develop about the construct of photography. And this is due to many things, but among others, the fact that a Nokia, at that time, I'm not sure if Nokia still exists, but at the time there were the small Nokia phones on which terrorists would behead a victim, and this would be, the poor image would actually become more convincing than the well-fabricated one. And all that induces, and I think it's not to be underestimated what the effect has been, it induces a certainty that photography is not what we thought it was. And it makes of photography from then on a conceptual thing. While before, one could always say there was a certain necessity to photography and a certain automatism, that this authentication between the person who has taken the image and the image that resulted out of that action had to be natural in a certain way. Somehow we always knew this is not the case, and there's a lot of fabrication going on for propagandistic reasons or others, and but it's a little bit like it was too hard, it's too collectively too difficult to admit that the size of the fabrication that photography always was. And I think there Wilhelm Flusser should not be underestimated in his stressing the importance that photography had in modernity. That it is precisely the speed, the fastness, and the magic of speaking a synthese language of images so much faster than written language, which he suggests at one point that actually saves modernity. That without that, we would probably, our planet might not even have existed. And now, so again, to come back a last time to this period around the 90s and 2001, and I think it has not publicly, or it has not been admitted even by us, the producers, the size and scope of fabrication that is in photography, precisely because it is part of ideology. And an ideology is something that you cannot actually analyze it, because you're inside of it and you're using it, you are living it, and you are producing it. And that is where I think, if you want to talk about the uncanny, that's an uncanniness of big size, which determine at the moment even the presidential elections in the United States, for example, or which I call have produced Berlusconi culture, where people would believe an image, or a politician could have ended his career or her career by a single image popping up at the wrong moment. So we have this explosive cocktail. The good news is, I think, that maybe this horizon actually might relax things a little bit, and that we might realize this sort of fabrication, it's all in. So perhaps it's not just bad news, but it might also be good news. And somehow I feel this announcing in big budget productions, some of such as WALL-E, or certain animations produced by Pixar, where you have this incredible liberty of play, and or this incredible cinema productions of, how was it called, Cars? No, this, how is this, Transformers, which is too stupid to name, but it's actually quite incredible. And this path might become sort of liberating movement. Now, so I would like to briefly, and I hope I'm not repeating myself, because some of you might have seen me talk or heard me talk about the same thing. One of the pieces that's in the exhibition is simply titled King, and it's one of my recent works, but it does actually refer back to early stardom in modernity, and it's of course related to Elvis Presley. And at one point in 1954, there was a young German photographer who had moved to the United States, named Alfred Wertheimer, and who was commissioned, on a mission to follow a young star who people didn't yet know very well, and who had just sort of in his early fame needed covering. And he spent about a week with Elvis Presley, while initially it was planned to be 2 days. But they got along well, and he shot a kind of thick book on which is titled Elvis at 21, which became sort of the best portrait of Elvis. And I had this image lying around in my archives since more than 10 years. And this is a way of working, is I do not hunt pictures, I wait for them. And I gather them, and they somehow, what I do is the opposite of what a war photographer would do. A war photographer would go into the action, and I'd be a little bit, I suppose, like similar to Sonja and Elger's practice, would be somebody who would be thinking about those images that have been produced, and that would consider them orphans in some way or another, precisely because they're disconnected in time, and they have lost. The more years pass, the more they lose their urgency. It's the same for war photography, but it's the same for this black and white picture of Elvis. And let me briefly explain what interpelled me in this picture, it was precisely there's no center. While the star figure of Elvis Presley is actually the center, but in the composition there is just a hole. It's actually the table, and then there's this view. So, being the coward I am, not even able to take a picture, I have a tendency of analyzing an image and letting it work for years, often in this case more than 10 years. Now what you've just seen is what I've made, and this is actually the picture that I started from. So the process of working would generally be to, like with good wine, not to drink it but to leave it for a while and to let it mature. Now of course I know that nowadays this is not possible anymore, and wine is there to be drunk immediately and of very good quality and then to be forgotten. But this is the way I work. I study, my training was actually not in new media, neither in cinema nor in photography. Up until the year 2000, I didn't know how to handle a camera. So I'm entirely self-taught, but I was trained as a painter, and more specifically actually as a draftsman. And so I have very associative behavior with pictures that I find and the research that I do consequently. Now a little bit towards the production, and I assume you will have seen the exhibition, but I'm not entirely sure.
Most people probably have seen it. Yeah.
Most have seen it, because otherwise this might be a bit in abstract. The way I've been working here is a combination between Dr. Frankenstein and Dr. Mengele, and some other doctors for sure, in the sense that I have worked with a scan of a body of Elvis Presley lookalike, not this guy, because the guy that you see here is, I used only his legs. And to do the reconstruction, this is the aunt of Elvis Presley being photographed. And here you can see the setup. It's 40 digital cameras making a simultaneous image from a single figure and then making a scan out of that image. So the produce of that is both photography but also a 3D scan of the figure. Then later on, we make this out of it, and this is actually already decomposited Elvis with the lower body taken from somebody, the upper body taken from an Elvis lookalike, and the face without the hair. And when I started working with 3D pictorial animation, it's just because I'm just hungry for other horizons, I suppose. It was about 5 years ago. I realized there's something strange going on, and I wrote a text which Ziba kindly commissioned me to do for the book on what I think is the future of photography. And the future of photography is, utopically, is pure madness. It's not, the end station is not observing at all. Because photography is a medium of light, and therefore of hope. And the end station of it is a scan. And a scan is basically the opposite of photography. A scan is separation. It's all about feeling and avoiding, while photography is all about embracing. And I combine both in this piece. So to continue about this process of working, the skin of hundreds, if not maybe more than 1,000 pictures of Elvis Presley in books, on the internet, and in various media have been collected and have been pasted together. This is what I meant with, I don't know if I meant that with Frankenstein or with Mengele, but it's been pasted together as accurately as I could. And then the skin has been folded again digitally on top of this Elvis Presley lookalike. So that the piece became about proximity but also, of course, immediately about the radical loss of any analog presence. What's with analog, by the way, nowadays? So it's like the uncanny. It's much to do about it. So this is still just screen grabs of this Elvis Presley under construction. He looks a little bit as if he's suffering from chemotherapy, but it's actually the skin being reapplied to the look-alike. And just just funny pictures which I gather from, like pieces of skin, nails from the real man being pasted together. A hand in progress, and you can see here the sewing together of. There's a lot of, in the virtual world, in which much of our thinking and observing is moving towards, I believe. In the virtual world, what you do generally is you exaggerate what lies in memory. It's a little bit as if you have lost your sight, and you are forced to go back to sensations that you remember for certain. And this is often the reason why I work with phenomena that do not necessarily belong to photography, but that belong to sensations that you have in your memory. Because I know for sure that everybody has experienced what the wind in a tree is, what the shadow cast by a tree is, or what sunlight means, the warmth of it, or the coldness of ice. And these are all, the things that really interest me. Of course, because I'm working on a flat surface like all of us, I'm in the impossibility of combining the tactile with the virtual. The last thing that we know that did that for us is pornography. And because I didn't see any use in that, I resorted to natural phenomena as memory. So to continue a little bit with this process, these are some screen grabs again of how a mold is made into a person. This is the mother of Elvis. So she has been cast from two people. Somebody who didn't fit physically but facially very well was combined with another person. This is atmospheric depth. And in a world which is virtual, the crazy thing is that your responsibility is infinite. You're having discussions with yourself about every small detail, about the color of grass, about the color of skin, about where should the virtual light in the room be, because you have to take decisions about everything. So you're actually, one of the other anxieties, I suppose, in the future of photography is that this increase in responsibility, where image making becomes decision making. And decision making, when it's disconnected from observation, is a entirely memory-based thing. So you are at the risk of reducing it to all sorts of cliches on human beings and all sorts of issues which require correctness or not. Well, I can, I'm just walking through this presentation very fast, and I come to the end of it, where we have Elvis's leg and the water humidity of him coming straight out of the, and we have this picture in the exhibition as well, which shows all the skin of Elvis pasted together. And I should stop because I've probably taken too much time. Thank you.
We have a lot of questions here, I'm sure, to actually bring up and discuss. A lot of it is perception and knowledge in a very different way. Maybe actually we could use an exhibition, perception and knowledge, I don't know, and in many, many different ways. I would like to open a question to the audience, and if there are any questions that we could. Yes, go ahead, please.
I wanted to pick up on your point, so I don't know your name. I think you described the uncanny between something that is an event and an experience. My sense of it has always been more about an encounter. And that the whole idea of the encounter is something that happens where you don't expect it, or it just comes upon you. And it draws out feelings that you're not quite sure, they're very ambiguous. The work I'm looking at in the show seems to be very much about creating, manufacturing the idea of the uncanny. And I'm interested in the idea that perhaps, it's one thing to experience it, but can you, and the idea of manufacturing it means that it's somehow contrived, and that, I don't mean that in a particularly negative sense, but the idea that you're creating something that, when it actually happens in real life, shall we say, that you don't expect it. Whereas if you go into a studio, if you go out into some sort of space, you're sort of creating it with an intention, and that way it almost ceases. I wonder if it ceases it to be uncanny.
I think that this idea of the manipulation is interesting in relation to the uncanny, to what David and Sonja has been talking about in the making of images, because what seems to have become familiar to us is really this manipulation, is really the manufacturing of images. So maybe in thinking about the images in the exhibitions and the work that we have seen, the spectrum of the familiar resides in the manipulation itself, in the manufacturing of the image, and of all the implications that this has. So the encounter, the ambush, if you like, of this sort of sudden experience might become much more subtle, much more nuanced, and is much more about the sort of thresholds of boundaries that the manipulation itself brings about, and asks us to question, to the point where the real has completely disappeared, as in the case of David's work.
I also think that I don't think that any of us really tries to create an image that is uncanny. I think it is more in the experiences that lay before this image has ever been done, things that we've experienced or that we've thought about, and that maybe goes into the process. But the aim is not to create an uncanny image, because that would be very limiting. You could very easily do that just by, creating something that is, I don't know, spooky or something. That would be just very one-dimensional and not interesting, and it would be contrived. I think it is much more interesting, the thought of the uncanny as something that happens that we don't quite have a control over. For me, it's something that happens in the perception, when I realize something that, maybe I thought how I perceive things, all of a sudden I realize that that's not the case, that it comes from a place that I didn't know it came from, and that is something I'm fascinated in, and then I work on that. And then but the goal is not to create an uncanny image. It's something that is based on an experience that was something that was created, not necessarily an unease, because it's also a good thing, as we mentioned before. It's also something that creates a curiosity. Sometimes it's just this, I didn't know that worked this way, about one's own perception or about more general ways. So I don't think, so what I'm saying is I don't think that the goal is to create an uncanny image.
Also, I think the uncanny is already so marketable and so much used and exploited in popular culture that, you know, not, maybe Gregory Crutzen produces uncanniness purposefully in his photographs, but I don't very often see it as I mean, certainly not in my case. I'm confronted with it all the time, but I never mean to produce.
No, but we spoke somehow around all the time photography, images, yeah. And the first person who did a difference between image and photography was Charles Baudelaire, talking in an essay on Delacroix, and we saw him slay the shot. He makes the difference in the world of photography, telling that there are two kinds of photography. The realists, and he called them a little bit ironically the positivists, and the imaginatif, yeah, the fantastic. And he makes the difference, telling that the realist, and this was always the ambiguity of Baudelaire, who said photography is a big art, and then later on he said, I'm not sure anymore, yeah, because he said there are the realists who describe something. He's doing an image, a photograph, yeah, of something like it is, or like it would be if he's not there. The fantast is doing an image. I'm trying to enlight something and give the reflection back to the people. And this is a different kind of idea of image and photography. And maybe what we now puzzle out about uncanny is that something is in the image that was given from the photographer consciously or unconsciously that puzzle us, the perceiver of the image, and he don't know where to put it, and he's looking, yeah, inside a normal photography of a kind of street description, or yeah, an event, or just a photograph of something that is only describing reality. Maybe we don't look for something that, yeah, it's just a description. And what David told about what happens with the computer and with the virtual world, and what's the uncanny situation in the perceiving photography today, is that all this photography was always manipulation. In the moment you are turning your head and you are seeing something, it's manipulation. And if you take the camera, it's already manipulation. But the new kind of virtual world and digital created images are now on the layer of what we thought it's photography. But we still have not found a new word for what we are doing. For me, it's not photography anymore. Yeah, it's something else. I don't know what, but it's not photography. And the description that you are photography is embracing and scanning is making a difference. I like this description very much, because it's really a testable thing of how to treat things. Yeah?
There's also maybe an ethical dimension entering into photography on a new level. Sort of decision making about what to and what not to, which is kind of new. Of course, it was always in photography. There was always, you could always be accused of doing this or praised of doing that, but there's a new ethical dimension. That's I think, and that's of course also a mental situation. It's not happening by itself in this automated manner anymore as.
What about time? Photography, you mentioned yourself, that is a good ally, was a true ally of modern life. But for example, when we think about the Baudelaire, what was at that time right, it was not uncanny. Today might be uncanny, or equally, as you say. So this element of time, this is something we need to talk maybe about. What do you think?
Do you mean the time that is situated in between the taking of the photograph and the observing? Yeah, but that's an interesting one, because that reminds me of a discussion that I once had with, actually more a fight, with a very well-known French war photographer. And I wanted to, I think I told you that I wanted to use one of his pictures as a basis for a work. And he thought my approach was completely respectless, because he asked me, do you know the name of the person in the picture? Do you know if the child with the blood on its head survived, etc., etc. And I obviously had made him angry, but I asked him, do you think in 50 years somebody will remember the name of the person, or will even care about? And this is, of course, the criteria used to read a picture, just like the Second World War happened in black and white and blah blah blah. These are so there, and I think I've always wondered why it was that there's this ever-growing technical distance between the observer, who's always in the now, and the picture, who's always in the then. And there must be a reason for it. It's not just technical. There must be a reason why 19th century photography has taken such a distance.
Yeah, but there's this fun thing. An example, there was this Swiss photographer taking images for the assurance companies of car crash, Odermatt. Yeah, and at a certain point, a curator discovered in this assurance company this huge collection of car crash images, and he took them out and displayed like art pieces. And the people perceiving now these images thought that maybe he constructed all these car crashes to make these images, but he was simply a photographer of the assurance company. So we are, and this is the idea of the conceptual idea of photography, that it's now that even older things are read in a new kind of alphabet, and everything is turning around somehow, so that we have even the feeling that a photographer in the 19th century,
but this
did a computer animation somehow,
That's also, I think, what makes the presence of photographers like Joel Sternfeld and Stephen Shore interesting here, because they have been operating in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and not so much on a fabricated manner, but yesterday actually we realized there might have been some manipulation in some of the pictures later on, more like today, but that they were, and that it's impossible to look with innocent eyes at those pictures if you've been through this exhibition. That you actually start to see everything as a fabrication, even the monumental works of Sternfeld, which look entirely fabricated after 2016.
What do you think, Sonja?
About the time?
Yes.
I think, well, I'm interested in this argument about the digital and the analog photography, and I agree with you, and that's coming from someone who works analog. For me, I think the fascinating thing about the digital is that it actually might be able to free us a bit more from the reality. I find fascinating how you use digital and then go so close, so skin close to the real, and making something that at one point was analog by ways of this person then into a digital picture, and create something that is at the same time totally attached and detached. I find that very fascinating, and that as far as time goes and as far as perceiving images goes, I think that's something that I find interesting in the future. For me, analog right now is something that I was interested in the concept of lying within the set, within having it had to be, I wanted it to be the precise point of where the manipulation would happen. So, but just using analog as a medium, just for the sake of it, it's just like listening to LPs instead of CDs or MP. So I do think that the time effort and the perception has so much changed, and that what is happening, the time changes the way we look, as you said, on images that were produced in the past, or as you said with Driftwood, we look at them differently, even though the image hasn't changed, we have changed. And that time aspect I find really fascinating, and that is of course something that happens now and happens in the future, and is like a parallel thing that is very close to photography because it's such a time thing, and the idea of the recording of a moment that is, you know, a moment, but it's not a precisely a moment that you can describe precisely, because even then it's a time span. It's always a time span, and so yeah, I mean, time is such a huge theme within in photography, both in the way that it develops and evolves, as well as in the medium itself, in every moment and every time that you do take a picture. And then your process is time. It's about time, the way that you collect, the way you wait for the image, and the way that it's being created. So too much to be said about it.
I forgot his name, but there was the photographer of the last Russian monarch went out in the fields, in the country, to explore the country in full color. And he was working, but I forgot his name. He was working in a method which was similar to what was developed in early color photography in the West, but his method was actually better. And if you look at the pictures that he made of Russian country life at that time, there's a strange thing happening, because they are so precise. They could have been printed the size of Joe Sternfeld's pictures, and you would think they would be entirely mise en scène yesterday. But they are authentic, and these are films. By the way, I realized that in your work, it seems that you are looking for punctum, because in the Roland Barthes way, because punctum occurs best when you have a sequence. It somehow occurs not in the image, but in between two images. And well, when we think that they just.
But that was like in the series, The Passage, you mean, where it is about the sequencing of the images. Yes, definitely. I mean, that was all about time. Yeah, how you read between the images, how you fill in the space, not only time-wise and but also space-wise. That's what I would try to do. That you start filling in the time that's missing, even though you can't really describe the time or the space, and they're both fake. So so it's all in your mind.
Great. I think we could have just spent the evening here, but since we are talking about time, I think we have now fully really passed the time that we were supposed to end this wonderful session, and I do really thank greatly the panelists, all of them, for the great, interesting topic.